The rain had been falling since Tuesday. Not the soft, misting kind of rain that Iowa farmers call a $1,000,000 rain. The gentle soaking that slides through topsoil without disturbing it, that coaxes winter wheat to green and pulls earthworms up toward the surface in joyful procession. This was a different kind of rain entirely. This was the kind of rain that arrives in sheets, in walls, in curtains that slap against the barn siding at odd angles, as though the sky itself has lost its composure. This was the kind of rain that fills the low spots first, then the furrows, then the fence lines, then everything else, until the old pasture behind Thomas Alderman's barn began to look less like a pasture and more like a shallow lake with fence posts sticking out of it. It was April of 1983, and Thomas Alderman had seen bad springs before. He had seen the spring of 1951, when he was 28 years old and his father was still alive, and the two of them had stood together at the edge of the south field watching the Raccoon River push its brown water across their corn ground, his father smoking his pipe and saying nothing for a very long time before finally remarking, "Well, Tom, she's having her say." He had seen the spring of 1965, when a late blizzard followed by a fast warm-up had turned every drainage ditch in Hardin County into a roaring creek. He had seen dry years and wet years and years that couldn't make up their mind, years when the wheat came in so heavy the combines groaned, and years when the corn ears were no bigger than a man's fist. But 1983 had announced itself differently from the start. The snowpack that winter had been deep, the kind of deep you don't fully appreciate until the first genuinely warm week of March, when it all begins moving at once. Add to that the relentless parade of storm systems that had tracked up from the Gulf of Mexico since mid-March, each one dropping 2 or 3 inches of rain on ground that was already saturated to its core, and you had a situation that old-timers in Hardin County were beginning to discuss in hushed, careful voices, the way men discuss things when they don't want to be heard speculating about the worst. Thomas stood at his kitchen window at 5:30 in the morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, watching the rain move sideways across the yard light's yellow circle. He was 60 years old that spring, a lean, angular man with hands like root gnarls and a face that the weather had worked over thoroughly for 4 decades. He had the kind of posture that comes from decades of real physical labor, not the stiff, upright posture of a man trying to appear tall, but the loose, forward-tipped posture of a man perpetually ready to pick something up, to lean into something, to put his shoulder against something that needs moving. His hair had gone the color of field corn in October, that particular silver gray that is neither white nor blonde, and he wore it short on the sides in the manner of a man who cuts his own hair and considers barbershops a luxury appropriate only for weddings and funerals. His wife, Helen, was still upstairs. She would be down by 6, as she had been every morning for 34 years of marriage, and she would make fresh coffee and eggs and probably biscuits, because Helen Alderman made biscuits the way other women breathe, automatically, without particular thought, as a simple matter of keeping the world running properly. Thomas set his cold coffee down on the windowsill and pulled on his Carhartt coveralls, the old brown ones with the tear at the left knee that Helen had patched with a piece of canvas the previous winter, and he went out to do his chores. The farm was 320 acres, which in 1983 put Thomas Alderman somewhere in the lower middle range of farm sizes for that part of Iowa. It wasn't the biggest operation in the county, not by a long stretch. Larry Hennessy up on the ridge had nearly 1,000 acres, most of it rented, and Dale Fritcher on the south end of the township had borrowed heavily in the late 70s to put together a 600-acre spread with matching green John Deere equipment lined up in his new steel-sided machine, shed like soldiers at attention. There were men in that county who were farming 3 times what Thomas farmed, men who had done the math in 1977 and 1978 when corn was touching $3 a bushel and land was appreciating at 15% a year, and the bankers in Eldora were calling farmers at home to offer them money, actually calling them up and offering it. And those men had decided that the sensible thing, the modern thing, the progressive thing, was to borrow and expand and get big or get out. Thomas had not borrowed. He had not borrowed in 1977, and he had not borrowed in 1978, and he had not borrowed in the gaudy, electric year of 1979, when it seemed like every farm implement dealership in Iowa was backordered 6 months on new tractors, and the Iowa State Extension agents were touring the county, giving talks about how American agriculture was entering a new golden age, how the Soviet grain deals and the global population boom meant that Iowa corn farmers were positioned to be the most prosperous generation of agricultural producers in the history of the Republic. He had sat in the back of the Grange Hall and listened to those talks. He had drunk the coffee and eaten the dessert bars that the extension agent's assistant brought in a Tupperware container. He had nodded at the right moments and kept his own counsel, as he generally did. And then he had driven home in his 1972 Ford F-100, a truck that had been old when he bought it used in 1976 and was now verging on ancient, and he had sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside, looking at the lighted window of his kitchen where Helen was moving around doing something sensible. And he had thought about his father, and about what his father had said one time about debt. Debt is just another word for obligation, his father had said. And obligation is just another word for whoever holds the paper telling you what to do. Thomas's father had said this in approximately 1949, when the agricultural lending apparatus of the United States was encouraging every farmer in the Midwest to modernize, to buy equipment, to consolidate, to grow. His father had listened to those arguments too, and had similarly kept his own counsel. This quality, the capacity to listen to a great many convincing arguments and remain unconvinced, was not always appreciated by the people around Thomas Alderman. His neighbors, some of them, thought him stubborn. The younger farmers who had come up in the 70s thought him timid, or worse, incapable of seeing opportunity. The loan officers at First National Bank of Eldora had a particular opinion of him that they occasionally expressed to each other over lunch. The loan officer's name was Gerald Whitmore, and he had arrived in Eldora from Des Moines in 1976, transferred by the bank's parent holding company to manage the agricultural lending portfolio for Hardin County. Gerald Whitmore was 34 years old and had a finance degree from Drake University and wore ties that his wife bought him at a department store in Ames, and he drove a Buick Riviera that he washed every Saturday morning in the bank parking lot, sometimes, when the weather was nice, in his shirt sleeves. He was not a bad man in any fundamental sense. He was simply a man who had been taught to believe that the numbers on a spreadsheet were more real than the texture of the soil, and that a farmer who didn't want to borrow was a farmer who didn't understand his own potential. When Thomas had come in to discuss refinancing in 1978, just refinancing, nothing new, just rolling over the small operating line he'd carried for years, Whitmore had spread out a whole presentation on his desk. Charts, projected cash flows, land value appreciation curves that looked like ski slopes going straight up. Mr. Alderman, Whitmore had said, in the patient, slightly condescending tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow, with your equity position, you could be farming 800 acres by 1982. A man in your position, not taking advantage of current market conditions, it's like leaving money on the table. Thomas had looked at the charts for a moment. What's the interest rate on that expansion loan? He'd asked. 9.5%, fixed for 5 years. And what happens at 5 years? Whitmore had smiled. By 5 years, Mr. Alderman, your land will have appreciated sufficiently that refinancing will be entirely straightforward. Thomas had looked at the charts a moment longer. I'll just take the operating line, he'd said. Whitmore had written something in his notes after Thomas left. One of Whitmore's colleagues, a younger man named Patterson who'd overheard the conversation, later reported that the notes said, Alderman, conservative, limited growth potential, resistant to modern AG practices. Low priority client. By the spring of 1983, the way things had broken was already clear to anyone who cared to look. The prime interest rate had hit 21.5% in June of 1981. Let that number sit for a moment, 21.5%. For a farmer who had borrowed $400,000 in 1979 to buy land at $3,000 an acre and equipment to work it, who had been making payments pegged to a floating rate tied to prime, the numbers had turned into something that kept him awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling while his wife pretended to sleep beside him because she knew there was nothing she could say. And then the land values fell. They fell the way something falls when it has been inflated beyond its natural state, and the inflation stops. Not gradually, not in the polite, gradual way that adjustments are supposed to happen in economics textbooks, but suddenly, savagely, the way a tire fails on a gravel road. Iowa farmland that had been worth $3,500 an acre in 1981 was worth $2,000 an acre by 1983, and still falling. And there were counties in Iowa where you could find farmland for $1,200 an acre that 3 years earlier had been financed at $4,000. The collateral was underwater. The loans were underwater. The farmers were underwater. They called it the farm crisis, as though giving it a clinical name could contain it. In Hardin County alone, First National Bank of Eldora had initiated foreclosure proceedings against 11 farm operations between January 1982 and March 1983. 11 families. Some of them had been farming the same ground for 3 and 4 generations. Some of them were men Thomas had known since they were boys running barefoot across haylofts. Men whose fathers had worked alongside his father. Men who had bought him a beer at the elevator and whose kids had gone to school with his own kids, and who had helped him put up a new section of fence one autumn when he'd thrown his back out and couldn't do it himself. One of those men was Raymond Kowalski. Raymond farmed 480 acres on the east side of Trestle Creek Road, about a mile and a half from Thomas's property line. He was 53 years old, built like a dairy cow, square and solid and close to the ground. And he had the best hands for corn of any farmer Thomas had ever known, which was saying something in a county where men had been breeding hybrid seed corn since before the Second World War. Raymond's father had emigrated from Poland in 1921 and had worked as a hired man for 6 years before saving enough to rent 40 acres and begin the long, grinding process of building something out of nothing. And Raymond had inherited not just the farm, but the particular disposition of a man who had learned from his father that nothing is ever truly yours until you've paid for it twice over. But Raymond had borrowed. He'd borrowed in 1978 to buy 200 acres of bottom ground that came available when old Earl Sutton finally retired. And the purchase had made sense. The ground was good. The price was reasonable by the standards of 1978. And the operating loans to put a crop on 680 total acres were manageable when corn was at $2.80 a bushel and interest rates were 10%. By 1982, corn had dropped to $2.10, and the interest rate on Raymond's operating line had been reset to 18%, and the land he'd bought for $2,400 an acre was now appraised at $1,600, and First National Bank of Eldora had sent him a letter in February that began with the phrase, "pursuant to the terms of your loan agreement," and went downhill from there. Raymond had a John Deere 4440, one of the big green ones, 130 horsepower, cab with air conditioning, and an 8-track player, power shift transmission, the kind of machine that would have made Thomas's father speechless with something between admiration and horror. He'd bought it in 1979, financed through John Deere credit at an interest rate that had seemed reasonable at the time. He also had a matched set of John Deere 7000 planters, a 6600 combined with a corn head, a 16-foot disc, a field cultivator, and enough other iron to fill half his machine shed with green paint. The bank held liens on all of it. In the second week of April 1983, First National Bank of Eldora sent Gerald Whitmore a memo from the parent holding company's loan recovery division, authorizing the repossession of the John Deere 4440 and associated implements from Raymond Kowalski's property. The memo cited Raymond's delinquency on the operating line. He was 60 days behind, and his failure to meet the conditions of a forbearance agreement the bank had offered in January. What the memo did not mention, because memos from loan recovery divisions do not generally bother with such details, was that the forbearance agreement had required Raymond to make a payment of $14,000 by February 15th, and that Raymond had managed to scrape together $11,000 of that by selling his pickup truck and borrowing from his wife's parents in Marshalltown, but that the remaining $3,000 had defeated him. $3,000. After a lifetime of work, Whitmore had forwarded the memo to the repossession company the bank used for agricultural equipment recovery, a firm out of Des Moines that called itself Midwest Asset Recovery Services, which was a name that told you everything you needed to know about what kind of company it was. Midwest Asset Recovery Services employed men who drove trucks and attached things to other things with chains and drove away. They were not cruel men, particularly, but they were men who had learned to not think too carefully about the domestic circumstances of the people whose property they were removing, in the same way that a slaughterhouse worker learns to think about something else. The two men Midwest Asset Recovery Services dispatched to Hardin County in the second week of April 1983 were named Bryce and Kevin. Bryce was the senior man, about 40 years old, with a broad face and a salt and pepper mustache that he had been cultivating since the Burt Reynolds movies made mustaches a statement of masculine vitality. He had been doing repossession work for 11 years, mostly farm equipment in the last 3, and he had the careful, methodical manner of a man who has learned that the most dangerous moment in his line of work is not when the farmer is angry, an angry farmer you can see coming, but when the farmer is quiet. Kevin was 26 and had been doing this for 2 years, and he had not yet developed Bryce's caution. Kevin was the kind of young man who had been good at football in high school and had discovered since that the world does not automatically organize itself to reward the formerly good at football, which had produced in him a certain aggressive edge, a tendency toward impatience, a way of walking into a situation that telegraphed, "Don't mess with me," before any words had been exchanged. They drove a 1983 Chevrolet K20, brand new. It had been purchased by Midwest Asset Recovery Services in February from a Chevy dealer in Des Moines, and it was a genuinely impressive machine by the standards of the day. A 3/4-ton four-wheel drive with the 350 cubic inch V8, factory tow package, the big aggressive all-terrain tires that were just becoming popular among the truck-buying public that year, the ones with the deep mudlug tread that looked serious and capable and modern. It was painted a particular shade of dark metallic blue that the Chevrolet catalog called midnight blue, and that caught the light in a way that said this is not a farmer's truck. This is a truck that belongs to someone who has decided that a truck should be impressive as well as useful. They also pulled a gooseneck equipment trailer, 32 feet long, rated for 40,000 pounds. It was the right equipment for the job they'd been sent to do. They arrived in Eldora on the afternoon of April 12th, met briefly with Gerald Whitmore at the bank, collected the paperwork, and checked into the Frontier Motel on Highway 20. Bryce made a phone call to his wife. Kevin watched television. It rained all night. In the old wooden barn at the back of Thomas Alderman's property, in the third stall from the left where he'd pushed it back against the wall sometime in the early 1960s when he didn't need it daily anymore, but couldn't quite bring himself to sell it, sat a machine that most people in 1983 would have walked past without a second glance. It was a Cletrac HG, manufactured by the Cleveland Tractor Company sometime in the mid-1940s. Thomas was fairly sure it was a 1946 model, though the records were not entirely clear. The Cleveland Tractor Company had been making crawler tractors, which is to say track tractors, since 1916, and they had developed over those decades a particular reputation for building small, tough, reliable machines that could work in conditions where wheeled tractors simply stopped working. The HG was the smallest crawler they made in that era, a modest little machine by any measure, with a 4-cylinder engine that produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 horsepower, which in the tractor world of 1983, a world of 150 horsepower four-wheel drive monsters, was enough to provoke outright laughter. But the thing about crawlers, and specifically the thing about the Cletrac HG, was not the horsepower. The thing was the tracks. The HG rode on wide steel tracks, wide enough that when you calculated the contact area between the machine and the ground and divided the machine's weight by that area to get what engineers call ground pressure, or what old-time farmers called how hard it presses on the ground, you got a number that was genuinely remarkable. The Cletrac HG, fully fueled, weighed roughly 4,200 pounds. Its track contact area was large enough that its ground pressure worked out to approximately 4.5 pounds per square inch. For comparison, a 1983 Chevrolet K20 with the big mud tires, loaded as Bryce and Kevin had theirs, exerted somewhere between 28 and 35 pounds per square inch on the ground. A grown adult male, standing flat-footed, exerts somewhere around 7 to 10 pounds per square inch through the soles of his boots. The Cletrac exerted less pressure on saturated Iowa spring ground than a grown man walking. Thomas Alderman knew this because he had learned it from experience, not from an engineering textbook. He had learned it in the spring of 1952, the year after the bad flood, when his father had first shown him what the old Cletrac could do on ground that a man couldn't walk across without sinking to his knee. His father had steered the little crawler out across the black, gleaming mud of the river bottom field, where the previous year's topsoil had been deposited in great silty sheets by the retreating floodwaters, ground so soft and yielding that it moved like slow water when you pressed your boot into it. And the Cletrac had floated across it, almost literally, its wide tracks spreading its weight so broadly that it barely dimpled the surface. She's all about the footprint, his father had said, watching. Doesn't matter how strong you are if you fall through the floor. Thomas had never forgotten that lesson. He had stored it away in the particular place where farmers store the things they learn from land and machinery, the deep practical knowledge that doesn't fit in books but doesn't leave you. Either, the way the smell of rain-wet soil doesn't really leave you once it's got into you deep enough. He kept the Cletrac running. People thought this was eccentric of him. Carl Bremer at the implement dealer thought it was eccentric, and said so in the indirect way of rural Iowa, which meant he said it to 3 or 4 other people who told Thomas later. Thomas's son David, who had gone to Iowa State and gotten a degree in agronomy and now farmed 200 acres of rented ground south of Ames, thought it was sentimental, a harmless old man's attachment to an old machine. Even Helen had once asked him why he bothered, when the old thing just sat back there in the barn taking up space that a useful implement could occupy. It'll come in handy someday, Thomas had said, and had left it at that. He maintained it with the same systematic care that he applied to everything mechanical on his place. Every fall, after harvest, he drained the old oil and put in fresh, checked the track tension and adjusted it if it needed adjusting. Went over the undercarriage looking for worn sprockets or cracked track links, lubricated everything that could be lubricated. He kept spare track pins in a coffee can on the shelf above the machine, and a spare set of ignition points in a small cardboard box. The old engine was one of the most reliable pieces of machinery on the place. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it was simple, because it had been built in an era when engineers designed machines to be fixed by the men who used them with the tools those men were likely to have, and because Thomas had never neglected it. In the spring of 1983, as the rain fell and the fields turned to something that was no longer really field in any useful sense of the word, Thomas had found himself spending a few minutes in the barn each evening, almost without intending to, standing next to the old Cletrac, running his hand along the cold steel of its hood. The way you check on something without quite admitting to yourself that you're checking on it. He had listened to the weather radio on the little Zenith transistor set in the kitchen. The National Weather Service out of Des Moines was calling for another 2 to 3 inches through the rest of the week, and the Des Moines River and its tributaries were running at flood stage and still rising. The ground was past saturated. There was nowhere for the water to go. He had driven past Raymond Kowalski's place on Monday and had seen Raymond's wife, Irina, hanging laundry on the porch in a break between rain bands, her face carrying that particular exhausted set that he had been seeing on women in this county for 2 years. The look of a woman who has been holding something together through will and stubbornness, and is beginning to wonder how much longer will and stubbornness are sufficient. He had stopped the truck and they had talked for a few minutes, his elbow on the window, rain pattering on the roof of the cab. Irina had told him about the bank letter. She had told him, in the flat, careful way of a person who has decided that getting emotional about a fact doesn't change the fact, that the bank was sending people to collect the 4440. When Thomas had asked, Gerald Whitmore called Raymond yesterday, she said. He said sometime this week. Thomas had looked at the fields around her place, the yard, the lane, the field across the road, all of it standing in water, all of it the color of chocolate milk where the surface had broken. He had looked at it for a long moment. You let me know, he had said, if anything comes up. Irina had looked at him with an expression that was part gratitude and part the weary skepticism of a woman who has been receiving sympathy for 2 years and has not found it especially useful. Thank you, Tom, she'd said. I will. He had driven home and gone out to the barn and started the Cletrac's engine, just to hear it run. It had caught on the 3rd turn of the crank, as it generally did when the weather was cold and damp, and sat there idling with its characteristic flat, industrial sound, a sound nothing like a modern tractor, a sound that belonged to a different era, like something a machine would sound like in a black and white newsreel. He had let it warm up for 10 minutes, listening to it, his hands in his coverall pockets, and then he had shut it off. They came on Thursday morning. Thomas was in his machine shed doing some maintenance on his own tractor, a 1967 Oliver 1800, a machine old enough to be showing its age but still sound, still capable, painted in the distinctive Oliver green that was slightly different from John Deere green in a way that only farmers could reliably distinguish. when he heard the sound of the truck on the road. He didn't look up immediately. The machine shed faced the road, and through the open door he could see the ribbon of gravel running north toward the Kowalski place. And after a moment he set down his wrench and walked to the doorway and watched. The K-20 was unmistakable. Dark blue, pulling the long equipment trailer, moving at a speed that said the driver was either unfamiliar with the road conditions or unconcerned with them. A little too fast for the soft shoulders, a little too confident for the mud that lay a few feet off the gravel on either side. Thomas watched it pass, watched the trailer tracking behind it, watched the truck's brand-new paint catch what little gray light came through the overcast. He noted the Des Moines plates. He went back to the machine shed and stood for a moment, not quite working anymore. Then he went inside and told Helen he was going to walk the fence line along the creek, which was something he did need to do. The creek had been pushing against the bottom fence, and he wanted to see how bad it was, but which also happened to take him on a path with a clear line of sight to the Kowalski lane. He pulled on his rubber boots, the tall ones that came to his knee, and he went out. The creek was bad. 2 sections of fence were underwater, the posts barely showing, the wires certainly submerged and likely pushed over by the current. He'd have to come back and pull wire and reset posts once it receded, which would be a several-day job. He noted where the worst sections were and stood for a while on the bank watching the brown water move, carrying sticks and last year's cornstalks, and an occasional foam coffee cup from somewhere upstream. All of it moving with the purposeful speed of something that has decided where it's going. He could see the Kowalski farmyard from the fence line. The blue truck and trailer were pulled up in the lane, and he could see 2 figures moving around near the machine shed. Raymond's machine shed, the old Quonset-style building where the 4,440 lived. He could see Raymond's shape too, standing apart from the other 2, his arms crossed in the way a man stands when he is making himself watch something he cannot stop. Thomas watched for a while. He could see when the trouble started, though he was too far away to hear anything. He saw one of the figures, the younger one, he thought, from the way the man moved, walk back to the truck, and the truck moved forward, pulling the trailer around to position it for loading. And then the truck turned off the gravel of the lane and onto the yard. Thomas went very still. Raymond's yard was not technically a field, but it might as well have been for the purposes of ground pressure. The yard was a short-cropped grass area between the lane and the machine shed, and in a dry year it was solid enough to drive anything across. In the second week of April 1983, after 3 weeks of near-continuous rain, Raymond's yard was 6 inches of spongy, water-saturated material overlying a pan of heavier clay subsoil that the spring rains had thoroughly hydrated. It was, in the structural language of soil science, failing. It had no bearing capacity worth mentioning. It was, essentially, a thin crust over a very large quantity of mud. The K-20 made it about 40 feet before the rear axle broke through. Thomas saw it happen. He saw the truck's rear end drop suddenly, saw the nose of the truck tilt up as the rear buried itself, saw the driver's immediate and entirely counterproductive response, gunning the engine, spinning the tires, which moved the truck approximately 18 inches forward while simultaneously digging it approximately 18 inches deeper into the ground. He saw the trailer jackknife slightly, its front end dropping as the truck's hitch sank. He saw both figures get out of the truck, and even from a distance he could read their body language with perfect clarity. The stiff, disbelieving stance of 2 men looking at something they cannot quite believe has happened to them with their brand-new truck. The rain, which had paused for most of the morning, chose this moment to resume. It came in a slow, heavy drizzle that was not dramatic, but was entirely steady, the kind of rain that gets into everything. Thomas turned and walked back toward his barn. He moved without hurrying, because hurrying was not a thing Thomas Alderman generally did. He walked with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who has decided what he's going to do and knows exactly how to do it, the stride that his wife would have recognized immediately, and that would have caused her to look up from whatever she was doing and think, "He's got something going." He went into the barn. He stood in front of the Cletrac for a moment. The machine sat in its stall the way old machines sit, settled, patient, occupying its space with the complete lack of self-consciousness of something that has been in one place a long time. Rust showed on the sheet metal in places, brown blossoms spreading from the seams where moisture got in over the decades, but the rust was cosmetic. The working parts, the track, the undercarriage, the engine, the drive system, were sound. Thomas had seen to that. He climbed up onto the seat, which was a simple pan seat with a rubber pad, the kind of seat that does not concern itself with ergonomics or lumbar support or adjustable armrests, the kind of seat that says you are here to work, and if you want comfort you should have chosen a different occupation. He primed the carburetor, a practiced, automatic procedure. 2 pumps, not 3. It had always been a 2-pump engine. Checked that the gear lever was in neutral, and pressed the starter. The starter ground for 2 seconds. The engine fired, caught, stumbled, and then settled into its characteristic idle, a low, uneven, mechanically honest sound, filling the barn with exhaust smell and warmth. He let it warm up. He sat on the pan seat and listened to the engine and looked at the barn wall in front of him, where 30-odd years of accumulated farm life showed itself in the things hung on nails, an old set of cultivator sweeps worn down to almost nothing, a coil of baling wire, because you never throw away baling wire, a child's drawing of a tractor that his daughter had made in about 1963 and that had been there so long it had become part of the wall itself, a calendar from a Massey Ferguson dealer. That showed 1971. A horseshoe hung above the door, points up, as tradition required. It had been there since his father's time. After 8 minutes the temperature gauge was reading where it should read. Thomas put the Cletrac in gear. He drove out of the barn and around the side of the building and down the fence line toward the road, taking the route he knew best, the one along the edge of the field where the ground was firmest, closest to the gravel road. The Cletrac moved across the wet ground with the particular sensation that Thomas had always associated with it and with no other machine, a kind of confident floating, as though the machine were skating on the surface of something that had no business supporting it, the wide tracks distributing the weight in the way that snowshoes distribute a man's weight, allowing passage where passage should not be possible. He reached the road, crossed it, and turned north toward the Kowalski place. He drove the Cletrac on the shoulder of the gravel road, or just off it, the way you learn to do with tracks, keeping the machine on the soft ground rather than the gravel, because steel tracks on gravel are hard on both the tracks and the gravel. The rain came down on him steadily. He didn't have a cab. The HG had no cab, just the open seat and the steering levers and the engine hood in front of him, which meant that within a quarter mile he was thoroughly wet across his shoulders and the back of his neck. He did not particularly care. He had been wet outdoors before. He came around the curve in the road that opened the view of the Kowalski farmyard, and he slowed the Cletrac to assess the situation. The K-20 was sunk to its frame rails in the back, which was worse than he'd estimated from a distance. The rear axle had broken through the yard crust, and the truck had settled until the frame was resting on the mud surface, the rear tires somewhere below that, invisible. The front tires were still on top, tilting the cab up at an angle like a ship taking on water from the stern. The gooseneck trailer had jackknifed, and its front wheels were buried almost as badly as the truck's rear wheels, which made the geometry of extraction more complicated. Standing water was pooling around the truck's running boards. The 2 Repo men were standing near the truck. Bryce, the senior man, had the wary stillness of someone who had transitioned from frustration to damage control. Kevin was on his phone, which in 1983 meant a gigantic car phone mounted in the cab. He had apparently waded back through the mud to reach it and was now standing outside the truck on the frame rail, which kept him about 6 inches above the water, talking into it with the animated, emphatic gestures of a man explaining a very bad situation to someone in an office in Des Moines. Raymond was still standing at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, watching. He had not moved from that position. Thomas pulled the Cletrac into the Kowalski lane and stopped it next to Raymond. He put it in neutral and let the engine idle. The 2 men stood there for a moment without speaking, which was fine. Thomas and Raymond had known each other for 30 years and had logged enough hours working together and near each other that silence between them was comfortable, the silence of men who don't need words to understand what the other is thinking. "Morning," Thomas said finally. "Morning," said Raymond. Thomas looked at the stuck truck. "How long they been like that?" "About 20 minutes. They tried a winch. They got a winch on the front bumper. Kevin tried it. There's nothing to anchor to out there. The yard's too soft to drive a dead man." Raymond paused. "They're not going to ask for help, by the way. Didn't expect they would. They asked me if I had a tractor they could borrow." Raymond's voice was entirely flat when he said this. "I told them the tractor was what they came for." Something moved in Thomas's face that might, on a less reserved man, have been a smile. I'll go have a word with them, he said. He climbed down from the Cletrac and walked across the wet gravel of the lane to the edge of the yard, where the solid ground ended and the mud began. He did not step off the gravel. He stood at the edge and looked at Bryce, who had been watching him approach. You need a pull, Thomas said. It was not a question. Bryce looked at him, looked at the old man in the wet Carhartt coveralls, looked at the ancient Cletrac idling in the lane. He had the expression of a man who is weighing his pride against his practical situation and finding the practical situation considerably heavier. What is that thing, he asked. Cletrac HG. 1946. That gonna pull us out? It'll move you if anything will. Your problem is your truck weighs more than the ground will hold. My problem is different. What's your problem? I don't have one, Thomas said. Which is why you need me. Bryce looked at him for another long moment. The rain fell steadily between them. Kevin had gotten off the phone and was watching from his perch on the truck's running board. We're insured, Bryce said, as though this were relevant. Good, said Thomas. Then your insurance company will enjoy talking to your tow truck driver about how he gets his tow truck out here without getting stuck the same way you did. That water coming up your door there is going to be into your cab in another hour or so. Thomas looked at the rising water with a considering air. Of course, if you want to wait for the water to go down, it usually takes about a week in a spring flood, and that truck of yours is going to have a real interesting insurance claim by then. Bryce said a word that is not printable in a family story. I'll help you, Thomas said, but we ought to discuss the terms. Kevin jumped down from the running board. Terms. His voice had the edge in it that Thomas had predicted, the young man's aggressive register. You want to charge us for getting pulled out? Thomas looked at him with the particular patient absence of expression that 60 years of dealing with difficult situations had given him. I was thinking, he said mildly, about Raymond. There was a pause. Bryce looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at the mud. I don't see what that has to do with, Kevin started. Kevin, said Bryce. Kevin stopped. Bryce looked at Thomas again with the careful attention of a man who is reassessing a situation. What about Raymond, he said. The late fee, Thomas said. The 60-day delinquency charge on his operating line. I've been told it's somewhere around $800. I want that waived before I hook up. We can't authorize bank fees, Bryce said. We're recovery agents, not. You've got a phone, Thomas said, nodding at the car phone still visible in the cab. Gerald Whitmore at First National in Eldora has a phone. I imagine the two of you can figure it out. Bryce stared at him. The water's still coming up, Thomas said helpfully. The call took 12 minutes. Thomas stood at the edge of the yard in the rain, hands in his coverall pockets, and waited. He was not impatient, because impatience was not something he generally experienced when he had the better of a situation. He watched the water in the yard. He watched the mud-lug tires of the K20, the ones on the front, which were still visible, and he noticed without particular comment that the fancy all-terrain tread pattern that looked so capable and modern on dry pavement was not doing the truck any measurable good in this situation. The tread was irrelevant. Ground pressure was not. Raymond came and stood beside him. After a moment, Raymond said quietly, Tom, you don't have to do this. I know. I mean, even if they waive the late fee, that doesn't fix what I owe. No, Thomas agreed. But it fixes what you owe this month. And this month is the month we're in. Raymond was quiet for a moment. What if Whitmore says no? Thomas considered this. Then these boys sit in the mud until the county sheriff can organize a different solution. And in the meantime, everybody in 3 townships knows the bank's repo men sank their new truck on your property. And Gerald Whitmore spends a week explaining to his boss why they're cleaning mud out of a $12,000 truck and a $40,000 piece of equipment all because they couldn't wait for the ground to dry. He paused. I imagine he'll say yes. He did say yes. Bryce waved Thomas over with a look on his face that suggested he had swallowed something that did not agree with him. Whitmore authorized waiving the delinquency charge, he said. He wants it noted that this is a one-time accommodation. I'd like that in writing, Thomas said. What? I'd like a written note to that effect. From Whitmore. Bryce, you've got paper in that truck somewhere. Have him read it to you over the phone, you write it down, you sign it as his representative. That'll do for now, and Raymond can call the bank tomorrow to get the official documentation. Kevin made a sound. Kevin, said Bryce again, in the same tone as before. The note was produced. Thomas looked it over, folded it, and handed it to Raymond. Raymond took it without looking at it, and put it in his shirt pocket under his jacket. His jaw was working slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is experiencing an emotion he has decided not to display. Thomas went back to the Cletrac. He had already mapped out the geometry of the extraction on his way to the phone conversation, had looked at the angles, the condition of the yard surface, where firm ground was and was not, how the trailer was positioned, what the Cletrac could and couldn't do. The trailer would have to come first, because the trailer's jackknife position was constraining the truck's movement. He'd pull the trailer back onto the gravel, unhook it, then go back for the truck. He drove the Cletrac carefully off the gravel and onto the yard. The sensation was immediate and familiar, the slight spreading sensation underfoot as the track settled onto the soft ground, the very slight give, and then the remarkable stability as the wide track spread the load and the machine remained on top, floating on 4,000 pounds spread across enough contact area that the ground never received more pressure than it could manage. The Cletrac moved across the yard with an almost insulting ease, its small engine puttering quietly, its tracks leaving shallow impressions in the wet grass that were nothing, compared to the tire trenches that surrounded the stuck truck like earthworks. Thomas brought the Cletrac around to the front of the trailer, because pulling from the gooseneck was safer than trying to hook to the trailer's rear. He produced a length of chain from the storage box behind the seat. A good, heavy-duty logging chain, 3/8-inch lengths, rated for 20,000 pounds, which was exactly the kind of chain you keep on a farm because there is always, eventually, a need for it. He hooked one end to the trailer's gooseneck coupler and the other end to the drawbar of the Cletrac. He looked back at Bryce, who was standing at the edge of the gravel watching with an expression that had modulated from incredulous to watchful. "Stand back," Thomas said. "Not dramatically, just practically." He put the Cletrac in low gear, the lowest gear, the creeper, the gear that translated 22 horsepower into something that felt considerably more substantial because of the mechanical advantage it provided. And he eased the clutch out. The chain came taut. The Cletrac's engine note changed, deepened, took on the laboring quality of a machine being given real work. The tracks dug in, not sank in, but gripped the surface, the cleats finding purchase on the top layer of soil and compressing it slightly without punching through. 22 horsepower. A mere 22 horsepower in 1983, in the age of 150 horsepower colossuses, in the age of twin-turbo diesels and 8-speed power-shift transmissions and tractors with air-conditioned cabs and FM radios. 22 horsepower applied through a gear reduction sufficient to push a very large amount of force down a chain. The trailer groaned, shifted, and came. It didn't come easily. It came the way stuck things come, with protest, with a sucking sound as the mud released the buried wheels, with a lurch as the first few inches of movement broke the suction, and then more steadily as momentum began to work in its favor. Thomas kept the pressure steady, kept the Cletrac moving at its deliberate crawler pace, and the trailer came with it, pivoting slowly on the gooseneck as it came off the yard and back onto the gravel of the lane. Bryce moved out of the way. The trailer settled onto solid ground with a clunk that you could feel through the earth. Thomas unhooked the chain. He looked at Kevin, who had moved around to watch. Kevin was staring at the Cletrac with an expression that Thomas recognized as the specific look of a young man who has just been comprehensively educated by something he had previously dismissed as irrelevant. It was not a pleasant look, because the lessons that come with that particular expression are expensive, but it was a useful one. Thomas had worn that expression himself, once or twice, at the age of 20 or so, and he remembered how it felt. He said nothing. He brought the Cletrac back onto the yard and hooked the chain to the K-20's front tow hooks, the factory tow hooks that were bolted to the frame, which was appropriate, since hooking to the bumper would have ripped it off. He assessed the angle. The truck needed to come back and slightly to the left to clear the trailer's position and get back to the lane. He adjusted the Cletrac's position accordingly. He pulled. The truck was heavier and more thoroughly stuck than the trailer had been. The suction of the mud on the frame rails was significant. Thomas could feel it in the way the chain resisted before the truck moved, could see it in the slightly greater effort the Cletrac's engine put out, the tracks creeping across the yard while the truck held stubbornly for a moment. But the Cletrac's ground pressure meant that it was not adding to the problem. It was not sinking. It was not spinning. It was applying its modest horsepower through its mechanical advantages and its track's grip in a steady, unrelenting, patient way, and patience, Thomas had found, was generally sufficient. The truck came free with a sound that made Kevin wince. It came in a long, deliberate slide backward, mud falling off the running boards and sheets, the rear tires, when they finally emerged from the ground, wrapped in black mud to the point of being unrecognizable, the wheel wells packed solid with what had formerly been Raymond Kowalski's yard. The truck moved back across the yard, the chain steering it slightly, and with some careful maneuvering Thomas brought it to the lane and back onto the gravel. He unhooked the chain and coiled it neatly and put it back in the storage box. He climbed down from the Cletrac. He walked over to where his machine sat idling and looked at the yard, the tracks the truck had left, the collapsed sections where the crust had failed, the mud walls around the holes where the wheels had been. Then he looked at the Cletrac's tracks across the same surface. Two shallow parallel impressions, barely deeper than footprints, already beginning to fill with water. He looked at them for a moment with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has seen something demonstrate the principle he has always understood. Bryce was looking at him. "That's quite a machine," Bryce said. His tone had changed. "Not warm." "Exactly." Bryce was a professional, and professionals don't become warm in the middle of a job, but different. The condescension was gone. "It is," Thomas agreed. "Where do you even find something like that?" "Came with the farm. My father bought it sometime in the 40s. Bryce looked at it a moment longer. Then he looked at Thomas. "We're still here to collect the equipment," he said. "The professional again." "I know," Thomas said. "That's between you and Raymond." There was a pause. Thomas climbed back onto the Cletrac, put it in gear, and drove it back down the lane toward the road. He did not look back. Behind him, he heard Raymond say something to Bryce, and Bryce say something back, and then the sound of doors. He drove the Cletrac back along the road shoulder, back through the wet morning air, back to his own farm, and pulled the old machine back into the barn and shut it off. He stood in the barn for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The rain fell on the barn roof with its steady percussion, the sound it had been making for days and would continue making for days more. He went inside to find out if there was any coffee left. Helen had watched the whole thing from the kitchen window. She had watched her husband drive the Cletrac down the road in the rain, and she had felt the particular mixture of pride and exasperation that 34 years of marriage to Thomas Alderman had refined to a very fine quality, like a good whiskey that has been aging long enough to be past the rough stage. She had made fresh coffee. She had not said anything when he came in, beyond "coffee's hot," which was her way of saying a number of things at once. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table that had been in that kitchen since they were married, a heavy oak table his father had built, a table that had hosted 34 years of breakfasts and a considerable number of important conversations, and she put a cup in front of him and sat across from him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "You got the late fee waived." "I did." "That doesn't save the tractor." "No." He looked at his coffee. "Doesn't fix the loan. Doesn't make the corn price go up. Doesn't make Raymond's land worth what he paid for it." He was quiet for a moment. "But it's something." Helen looked at him. After a moment she said, "Your father would have done the same thing." Thomas didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. There is a quality that the best farmers share, and it is not the capacity for dramatic gestures or memorable speeches or the kind of heroism that gets commemorated on plaques. It is something quieter and more durable, the capacity to meet the ground on its own terms, to understand what you cannot change, and to work patiently within those limits, to know your tools. Each one, its nature and its purpose and its specific capability, as well as you know your own hands. It is the capacity to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be called conservative and limited and unambitious, and to go on farming anyway, to keep the old machine running because you have learned that old and useless are not the same thing, and that sometimes the old solution is the right solution. Thomas Alderman had not saved Raymond Kowalski's farm that morning. The bank would eventually, after several more months of negotiations and a partial debt restructuring that left Raymond farming on thinner margins than before, allow Raymond to keep the bottom ground he'd bought in 1978 while recovering 2 pieces of equipment under the lien. Raymond would farm a smaller operation for the rest of his life, and he would do it carefully, the way a man who has seen the consequences of incaution farms, attentively, without fanfare, keeping close to the ground. But the late fee was waived, and in 1983, $800 was not nothing. It was a utility bill and a half. It was seed corn for 20 acres. It was 3 months of groceries for Irina Kowalski's table. It was the specific, particular difference between a month that was merely hard and a month that was impossible. By noon, the story had traveled to 4 other farms in the township by the mechanism that farm communities have always used for news. A phone call from Helen to Dorothy Freeberg, a brief exchange between Raymond and Carl Bremer at the elevator, and the network had done the rest. By evening it had reached the grain elevator in Eldora and the coffee counter at Hartman's Cafe and the waiting room at the implement dealer, and people were telling it with the additions and embellishments that good stories always accumulate as they travel, so that by the time it reached the Grange Hall meeting on Friday night, the Cletrac had grown to the size of a full-scale bulldozer, and the bank's truck had sunk to the point where the antenna was the only thing visible above the waterline. Thomas, who attended the Grange Hall meeting, sat in the back row and said nothing when the story was told, which is what he generally did. In the fall of 1983, after the floodwaters had receded and the mud had dried and the crops that had survived were harvested, and the ones that hadn't were filed on the crop insurance that Gerald Whitmore's bank had quietly insisted on as part of every loan agreement since 1982, which turned out to be a rare piece of useful financial advice. Thomas Alderman did something he hadn't done in several years. He went to the Hardin County Historical Society's fall exhibit. The Historical Society met in the basement of the Carnegie Library in Eldora, in a room with low ceilings and fluorescent lighting and display cases that smelled of old paper and wood polish. The fall exhibit that year was about the history of agriculture in Hardin County, and it featured photographs that Thomas had never seen before. Photographs from the 1920s and 1930s, black and white images of men and horses, and early tractors in fields that he recognized, fields that adjoined his own or that had been parts of farms that were now subdivided or combined. Fields that had been farmed by the grandfathers and great-grandfathers of people he knew. He stood for a long time in front of one particular photograph. It showed a man, no one he could identify, driving what appeared to be a very early crawler tractor across a wet field. The field was obviously saturated, the kind of field that told its condition clearly even in black and white. The wheeled tractor in the background of the photo was stuck to its axles. The crawler was moving, the driver's posture upright and unhurried, moving across the impassable ground with the particular ease of something that understands its own nature and asks only to be used correctly. The photograph was undated. The caption said only, "Crawler Tractor, Hardin County, CA 1935. Thomas looked at it for a long time. The thing about land, about any land, but particularly about Iowa farmland, that black, deep, glacially deposited soil that was the result of 12,000 years of biological accumulation after the last glaciers retreated, is that it has a memory of its own. It remembers what has been done to it. It remembers the root channels of 10,000 generations of prairie grasses, channels that make it drain better than soil without that history. It remembers the earthworm tunnels and the organic matter and the microbial communities that live in it and work in it, and turn dead material into the chemical building blocks that plants need. It remembers floods. It remembers droughts. It knows how to take what comes and go on producing, as long as the people working it have the patience to work with it rather than against it. The worst thing that had been done to Iowa farmland in the decade before 1983 was not the debt, though the debt was bad. The worst thing was the pressure, the relentless, incentivized pressure to treat the land like a factory floor, to push it to maximum production every year, to plant to the fence corners, to tile every wet spot, to disc under the cover crops and the terraces and the practices that had been developed over generations to keep the soil in place when the rain came. The men who had borrowed to expand had borrowed not just money but a philosophy, the philosophy that efficiency meant maximizing output per acre per year, and that philosophy had moved across Iowa farmland like a slow flood of a different kind, eroding something that could not be easily measured in a year or a decade, but that the land registered, the way the land registers everything. Thomas had not adopted that philosophy, not because he was smarter than the men who had. He was not a man who thought himself smarter than others, but because his father had taught him a different one, a philosophy that said the land is in your care, and care means more than extraction, and also, practically speaking, that the way to farm for 50 years is different from the way to farm for 5 years, and that if you cannot tell the difference you will eventually find out the hard way. He had found out what kind of farmer he was in the spring of 1983, watching a Cletrac that was born before the Second World War float across ground that had swallowed a brand new truck. Helen Alderman died in 1991 of a stroke in the kitchen where she had made biscuits for 38 years. Thomas was with her. He farmed alone after that, with some help from David and from Raymond, who by then had rebuilt his operation to the point where he could occasionally spare a day to help a neighbor, and from various hired men over the years, young men from town who needed summer work and who learned things from Thomas Alderman that their agricultural management courses at Iowa State had not quite covered. The farm is still in the family. David's son, Thomas's grandson, farms it now, 320 acres, the same 320 acres it has always been, in a county where some farms are now 5,000 acres operated by a single man in a GPS-guided, satellite-connected machine that costs more than the entire Alderman farm. The grandson, whose name is also Thomas, came home from college in 2018 to help his father and stayed because the land got into him the way it gets into people who work it with their hands, and because there are worse things to do with your life than work good ground. In the old barn, in the third stall from the left, there is still a Cletrac HG. The younger Thomas has been asked, more than once, whether he wants to get rid of it. He has given the same answer each time. It'll come in handy someday, he says. He says it in exactly the tone his grandfather used. In the spring of 2019, after a wet April not unlike the April of 1983, the younger Thomas had occasion to drive the old Cletrac, which he had maintained in the same careful way his grandfather had, the way things are maintained when they are understood to be important, across a saturated field to retrieve a neighbor's stuck ATV. The ATV was a modern machine, lightweight and powerful and equipped with features that would have been science fiction to his grandfather, and it had broken through the crust of a wet bottomland field and was sitting up to its belly in mud, going nowhere. The Cletrac floated across and pulled it free. The neighbor, a young man of about 30 who had grown up on the farm next door and had absorbed enough of the local culture to recognize what he was seeing, watched this with the particular expression of a person receiving an education. "How old is that thing?" he asked. "About 75 years, said the younger Thomas. "And it just drives across that mud like nothing." "It's not about age," the younger Thomas said. "It's about ground pressure." He said it the way you say something that was told to you by someone who was told it by someone who learned it from the land itself, which is the oldest and most reliable form of transmission. He coiled his chain and put it back in the storage box, the same storage box his grandfather had mounted to the Cletrac sometime in the 1960s, a coffee can-sized sheet metal box with a simple hasp latch, and he drove the old machine back across the mud field to the hard ground, moving at the deliberate, patient crawler pace that neither hurries nor delays, that simply proceeds. The field around him was April black and wet and smelled of the particular organic richness of soil that has been through a winter and is preparing for spring, the smell that is not quite like any other smell on earth, the smell that farmers know the way they know their own names. It had rained the night before, and it would likely rain again before the week was out, and the ground would need another few days before it was fit to work. He knew this, and he was not impatient. There were things to do in the barn. The machine shed roof had a section that needed attention. His grandfather's old Oliver 1800 was due for new rings, a job he'd been meaning to get to since fall. The fence along the creek needed walking. There is always something to do on a farm. That is one of its constant qualities, a quality it shares across all the decades and all the changes, regardless of what year it is, regardless of whether the commodity markets are high or low, regardless of whether the bank is in a mood to lend or a mood to collect. There is always something to do, and the doing of it, day after day, season after season, generation after generation, is how the land gets kept. That is what Thomas Alderman knew in April of 1983 when he drove the Cletrac out of his barn in the rain, and it is what the land has been saying all along, to anyone patient enough and quiet enough to hear it. In memory of every farmer who kept the old machine running. You knew why?